essentially what this means is that these products, and by the way, this candle, $64 from the Was Never website, $77.
The atmosphere inside Clarence house carried more than just a chill. It bore a crushing weight, as though the very stonework was breathing out the burden of 10 centuries of legacy. The time stood precisely at 9:15 on a bleak, cloud-smothered London morning toward the end of September 2025. Beyond the palace walls, life continued without pause. Visitors raised their cameras toward the expressionless sentries, and the great city pulsed with its relentless, familiar rhythm. Yet behind the formidable twin oak doors of the king's personal study, a stillness had descended so complete that it seemed as if the very pulse of the crown had momentarily ceased. This gathering had never appeared on any official schedule. No camera lenses were present, no communication staff wore their rehearsed expressions, and not a trace of ceremonial grandeur graced the room. In its place, an urgent convening had been arranged in such profound secrecy that even the most experienced royal journalists had caught not the faintest rumor of its existence. Assembled within were the king's most trusted legal minds, their complexions drained to an ashen pallor, alongside 2 veteran palace officials who appeared to have endured a decade of hardship in a single sleepless night. Between them stood the king's chief private secretary, his grip tightening around a leather-bound dossier stamped in stark, unsettling red lettering reading, "Confidential Domestic Action." Then the heavy doors swung open. King Charles III entered, though the man who crossed the threshold bore little resemblance to the composed sovereign the nation had witnessed only days prior. His frame trembled visibly. Each footstep was measured and labored, as though he were pressing forward against an invisible current, until he lowered himself into the chair at the head of the long mahogany table. His hands shook with such intensity that he interlaced his fingers tightly to suppress the trembling. His eyes, encircled by the rawness of what appeared to be days without rest and possibly grief, struggled to hold the gaze of men he had relied upon throughout his entire reign. When at last he found his voice, it lacked every trace of the commanding tone the world had come to associate with royalty. It fractured under the weight of his words. It was the unmistakable sound of a man standing at the precipice of complete inner collapse. What he then uttered would instantly spark a raging controversy and reverberate through the chambers of history for generations yet unborn. Turning toward his assembled advisers, the king whispered in barely audible tones, "I intend to separate from Queen Camilla." For several suspended seconds, that terrifying stillness returned, heavier and more suffocating than anything that had come before it. Every man seated in that room was a seasoned witness to royal upheaval. They had weathered the narratives surrounding the abdication crisis of 1936 and endured the deeply damaging dissolution of Charles and Diana's marriage in 1996. But what confronted them now felt entirely, unsettlingly. Virginia wrote that Maxwell had drawn close and murmured into her ear, telling her that much like Cinderella herself, she was about to come face to face with a handsome prince before the night was through. But there was not a single trace of any fairy tale waiting to unfold. According to the account laid out within the memoir, Andrew had been nothing resembling the charming and gracious royal figure one might have imagined. He had instead presented himself as a man who had correctly estimated her age with ease, and had then, with a coldness that defied comprehension, casually remarked that his own daughters were only marginally younger than the girl standing before him. That solitary detail, preserved and documented within her final written testimony, sent a visible shockwave crackling through the consciousness of the British public. It constructed the image of a man who was not simply oblivious to the profound gravity of what he was doing, but who demonstrated an active and deliberate indifference toward it that was in many ways far more disturbing than ignorance could ever have been. The true and lasting power of the memoir resided in its remarkable capacity to illuminate the interior psychological landscape of Prince Andrew himself. Virginia wrote that the prince appeared to operate from a foundational belief that access to her was something to which he was simply and naturally entitled. She painted a portrait of breathtaking arrogance, a deeply embedded conviction that his standing as a member of the royal family placed him entirely beyond the reach of ordinary law and absolved him completely of any obligation to the boundaries of basic human morality. This was never merely a story about a criminal act. King Charles was already fighting his own battle with cancer, while the monarchy was struggling to find its footing in a rapidly changing modern Britain. The sympathy generated by Virginia's tragic death, combined with the graphic nature of her allegations, forced the king into action. He recognized that the Andrew situation was no longer a private family matter. It had become an existential threat to the crown itself. Yet while the king was weighing his options, he was being driven toward a radical course of action by his eldest son. Prince William had been observing the unfolding crisis with a cold, calculated fury. He understood that for the monarchy to endure into the next generation, his generation, it had to be perceived as an institution rooted in accountability and integrity. William reportedly held several confidential meetings with his father, issuing a firm ultimatum. The monarchy could not move forward as long as Andrew remained a part of it. William maintained that every day Andrew continued to hold the title of Royal Highness was another day the family signaled that they considered themselves untouchable by the law. He urged his father to resolve the matter before it left a permanent stain on William's own future reign. Andrew, however, had no intention of stepping aside without a fight. Just 4 days before the memoir reached the shelves, sensing the noose tightening around him, the Duke made a desperate and calculated preemptive move. Yet the moment those pages passed through his hands, the moment the full weight of what had been unfolding behind his back registered in his mind, something fundamental within him gave way entirely. The report put forward the claim that deliberate and carefully timed leaks had been engineered with the sole purpose of enhancing the Queen's standing in the eyes of the public, and that this had been achieved at the direct and conscious cost of other members of the royal family, among them the King's own sons and even the King himself. It was calculated betrayal dressed in the costume of devotion, and for Charles, a man whose entire being was anchored to the preservation and dignity of the institution he represented, there could be no greater act of treachery. The monarchy was already navigating dangerously turbulent waters, with the king confronting deeply personal health struggles in the aftermath of a cancer diagnosis, and with public confidence in the crown hanging from what felt like a single fraying thread. This revelation carried the destructive force of a precisely placed explosive charge. Charles understood with cold clarity that if these details found their way into public consciousness before he took decisive action, the institution itself might not endure the consequences. He stood utterly alone on that island of realization, grappling with the devastating possibility that the one person he had always regarded as his most steadfast companion might in truth represent the single greatest danger to everything he had spent his life building. Yet, even as the king moved to place his signature on the preliminary documents, he carried the sobering awareness that this was merely the first piece in a much larger collapse. For while his marriage was disintegrating behind carefully closed doors, his brother, Prince Andrew, was poised to drag whatever remained of the structure down into the open light of public scrutiny. The tremors felt within Clarence House that morning were simply the opening movement of a month that would permanently and irrevocably reshape the identity of the British royal family. What the king could not yet know was that the spectral presence of a woman named Virginia Giuffre was preparing to step out from the long shadows of a buried past, carrying within her hands a memoir so explosive that it would strip the Duke of York of every last refuge he had ever known. Even as the king wrestled with the gut-wrenching sense of betrayal emanating from within his own marriage, all of it playing out beyond the sealed doors of Clarence House, a far older and far more unforgiving darkness was making its way steadily across the Atlantic Ocean, moving with quiet but unstoppable purpose directly toward the very core of the British monarchy. It was the shadow cast by a woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades pouring every ounce of her strength into the desperate effort to make her voice heard, only to discover that her most powerful and definitive triumph would arrive not during her lifetime, but in the profound and haunting stillness that followed her death. Her name was Virginia Giuffre, and though she no longer walked among the living to witness what was coming, the final testament she had left behind was on the verge of accomplishing something that no attorney, no courtroom, and no prosecutor had ever succeeded in doing. It was going to reach into the carefully guarded world of a prince and systematically dismantle his dignity, his privilege, his residence, and the very name he had sheltered behind for the entirety of his life. For years, stretching into decades, Virginia had released carefully chosen fragments of her deeply painful story, accounts involving Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and the constellation of wealthy and influential men who had regarded her as nothing more than an object to be used and discarded without consequence. Yet the world had never once been granted access to the raw, unfiltered, and complete truth of her experience, not until the arrival of her memoir bearing the quietly devastating title, Nobody's Girl. The circumstances surrounding its emergence were equal parts heartbreaking and incendiary. Virginia had ended her own life in April of 2025, leaving in her wake a manuscript that functioned as nothing less than a legal and emotional device set to detonate at a predetermined moment. When the book finally made its way into the world in October of that same year, it did not merely rise through the bestseller rankings, it annihilated every benchmark that had come before it. Even in the days preceding its official launch, the memoir had already seized the top position on Amazon's global charts without any sign of relinquishing it. As countless readers across the world braced themselves to encounter the written record of a living nightmare, what greeted them within those pages was a narrative constructed with such searing emotional honesty and unflinching personal clarity that it rendered every denial ever issued from within the palace walls hollow, callous, and utterly unconvincing. Virginia's account trained its most intense focus squarely upon Prince Andrew, and the particulars she laid out were as meticulously precise as they were deeply disturbing to absorb. She recounted with agonizing and unsparing detail the manner in which she had been coerced into physical intimacy with the Duke on 3 distinct and separate
They say you
occasions,
can choose fate, but you
each of
can't
them
choose
occurring
family.
when she
Yet
was
Meghan
no
Markle
older
seems
than
to think
17 years of age. Among all the deeply unsettling passages contained within the book, none carried a more chilling or suffocating weight than the one in which she revisited the very first encounter between them, which had taken place inside Ghislaine Maxwell's private residence in London. It was a story about the intoxicating, corrupting influence that unchecked power breeds in those who wield it without accountability. As readers continued turning through the pages, the allegations contained within them grew progressively and almost unbearably more damaging in their scope and implication. Virginia disclosed that throughout the prolonged and grueling course of their legal confrontation, Andrew's representatives had allegedly made deliberate efforts to contract internet trolls for the specific purpose of targeting, harassing, and systematically destroying her credibility across online platforms. She spoke with unflinching candor about how members of his personal security apparatus had been deployed to excavate and weaponize details from her private past, the entire operation designed with one singular objective in mind: to silence her permanently and ensure that her truth never reached the ears of the world. Yet perhaps the revelation that landed with the most devastating force, particularly in the mind of the king himself, was Virginia's vivid account of Andrew's profound moral cowardice. She described in precise and damning detail how he had retreated to the sheltered grounds of Queen Elizabeth's Balmoral estate, nestled deep in the Scottish Highlands, positioning himself deliberately behind its heavily secured perimeter and exploiting the protective presence of the aging monarch as a living shield, rendering it practically impossible for her legal representatives to successfully serve him with the court papers he was legally obligated to receive. The resulting image of a fully grown man, a decorated combat veteran who had served during the Falklands War,